The night my son died, I learned how thin the armor of a mother's certainty could be. I am Amelia Grant. For 32 years, the law was my language and my refuge. In courtrooms from Baton Rouge to Biloxi, I argued for clients whose lives teetered on the edge. I learned to read a room the way others read faces. I believed I could survive anything, until Matthew didn't come home. Matthew was my firstborn, fierce and compassionate. He had the quick temper of someone who believed injustice should not be tolerated. When he was taken, stabbed in an argument that spun out of control, something inside me cracked in a way no statute could mend. The police calls, the autopsy, the empty rooms. All of it taught me a new vocabulary of absence. Loss became a daily lesson. Before we dive into this gripping story, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching this from. I'd love to see how far Evelyn's story travels. After Matthew, Bianca became the axis of my life. She arrived later than many mothers expect, quiet and careful, with an old gaze that softened whatever grief remained. She called me Mama with a reverence I had not earned but was determined to keep. Every deposition, every brief, every investment I made, I imagined as a thread in the safety net beneath her feet. Raising 2 children alone was not triumph but endurance. My marriage ended in shrapnel. My ex-husband and his family offered criticism rather than consolation. Blood did not equal loyalty. When home became untenable, my parents urged me to leave. New Orleans became our refuge. Humid, stubborn, and full of chance. There, I rebuilt with a borrowed desk and a stubborn will. The work, criminal defense, wills, civil suits became an engine. Cases others avoided I took. Each victory and loss was paid into a ledger of security for Bianca. Through shrewd investments and well-placed real estate buys, I accumulated enough to plan legacies rather than just bills. Endurance has a cost. Years of adrenaline and sleepless nights left me with a chronic condition that aged me prematurely. Lines deepened, hands trembled, and doctors advised caution I refused to heed outwardly. I learned to hide strain. Courtrooms demanded presence, not pity. I also learned discretion. I did not broadcast every property or investment to Bianca. Not from shame but from a belief that some parts of us are better kept private, so they can stand uncontested. I wanted her to build pride in her work, not lean on a safety I felt she had to understand only when necessary. Yet I eased burdens when I could. A mortgage on a modest home when she started at a Big Four accounting firm. Allowances through tight months, a quiet transfer here and there to keep her afloat. We had rituals that mattered more than money. Friday dinners, late-night talks about small fears, her laughter that made even bad days bearable. She steadied me. When the law demanded ruthlessness, home demanded softness. Those rituals knitted us closer than any contract. Grief reshaped us both. After Matthew, tenderness and ferocity coexisted in uneven ways. I guarded Bianca as someone guards fragile glass. With a mixture of devotion and strategy, I imagined love and provision could inoculate her against betrayal. I would later learn that love is porous to power, and silence compounds misunderstanding. The foundation of our life felt secure. My law practice, the houses, the investments, but seeds can be trampled when not tended. I believed I had planted enough for Bianca to flourish. I did not know a daughter's absorption into another family could feel like an erasure, nor did I foresee the ease with which a well-bred smile could redraw the map of her loyalties. That first chapter, my work, my loss, the secret safety nets, the quiet rituals, was the bedrock. I leaned on it the way a lawyer leans on precedent. It was solid, defensible, logical. What I had not anticipated was how rapidly another person could redraw my daughter's world and make my presence optional. I had been trained to fight for causes. I had not been trained to fight for my place in my child's life. When the stakes became personal, I would have to learn fast or lose far more than property. There was one case that changed the rhythm of our lives. A messy custody battle where a single testimony flipped the outcome. The settlement paid unexpectedly well. With that money I bought a worn shotgun house on a narrow street. It was modest, but it became the first tile in a mosaic I slowly assembled. Rentals, a small downtown office, then land. I treated legal fees like seed money. Contracts became building blocks, settlements turned into down payments, and prudence became its own quiet strategy. Bianca watched those moves as a curious child and later as an accountable adult. I remember the pride in her voice the day she told me about her first promotion. She whispered into the phone, "Mama, they said yes." Her gratitude felt like a small verdict in my favor, proof that the work had not been for nothing. We had rituals, Friday dinners, late-night talks, and a language of practical affection. I tried to teach her autonomy. I wanted her accomplishments to be hers, not an inheritance by default. Looking back, I see that some of my secrecy had unintended consequences. I thought discretion would protect her dignity, but silence can leave a vacuum. I had protected her body and bank accounts. I had not prepared for the ways loyalty can be corroded by glamour and influence when it appears. I would discover later how quickly influence can reframe love, and that even the strongest safety net can fray under new weight. And consequences followed. I promised myself one thing the night I packed the last box of my wedding china. Never again would anyone erase me. Marriage had been an early calculus, love balanced on practical terms. My husband and I married young, in a courthouse ceremony that felt less like an exchange of vows than a compact for survival. He was charismatic in public and distant at home. His family, pedigreed and sharp-tongued, treated me like a temporary occupant in their lineage. In the early years the insults were small, offhand comments at family dinners, backhanded critiques about my work, but they accumulated like sediment, grinding at the edges. For years I tolerated kitchen gossip and holiday criticisms, because I believed marriage could be shaped through endurance. I believed, perhaps naively, that law and love would find alignment. But the deeper I immersed myself in legal practice, the more fissures appeared. My husband resented the late nights and the attention I drew. His family, sensing weakness, made their presence felt through barbed language and undermining advice. They were the sort of people who measure worth by appearances, and in that currency I found no purchase. The turning point was slow, an erosion rather than a single explosion. Money prioritized appearances while essentials lagged. He began siding with his family over me, tolerating small humiliations until they compounded into a pattern of control. Arguments shifted from sharp words to threats wrapped in promises. The partnership I'd assumed dissolved into leverage. When it became clear I was raising our children alone, the decision to leave hardened. My parents offered refuge without drama. They had seen the strain and reached for practical solutions. A room, a few dollars, a listening ear. So I packed Bianca into the car and left. New Orleans felt like a fresh ledger. Humid air, stubborn streets. A place where reinvention was possible if one was willing to do the work. Starting over at 40 with 2 children and a bruised heart was not graceful. I rented a small duplex with a sagging porch and learned to sleep in spare moments. There were times I took cases with barely enough fee to cover a filing. There were evenings when laundry sat in a pile, and my children ate dinner at odd hours because I had a deposition across state lines. I kept a ledger with 3 columns, expenses, deadlines, and a list titled What We Cannot Lose. That list was short: Bianca's education, my professional license, and the quiet right to choose our lives. New Orleans, with its humidity and jazz, became a place of apprenticeship. The legal community is clannish, but I found allies. Other women who juggled family and practice and understood the tiny mercies of a late win. I argued a case pro bono and won because the judge recognized the raw honesty in my client's plight. A local paper ran a piece, and a small influx of paying clients followed. Each client I helped paid for another repair on the duplex and a small deposit on a rental. People romanticize reinvention, but the truth is logistics. Licenses, filing fees, leases, and the patience to answer for mistakes. I made errors, one bad investment, one misguided partnership, but I learned to translate courtroom skills into business decisions. Negotiation and bench hearings had a sibling in negotiating mortgages. Due diligence and evidence learned to navigate property titles. Slowly, the ledger filled in a different direction. Assets instead of obligations. And yet trauma lingers. The nights that followed Matthew's death were lessons in survival. Court, funerals, angry questioning from strangers who thought they had a right to judge how a mother grieves. I developed a posture that read as composed and efficient, but inside I was a woman who knew the taste of old grief. I used that posture to my advantage. It made others underestimate the coal of fury and tenderness that kept burning beneath my work. By the time I started to see real returns, rental income, a small but reputable firm, the idea of safety felt less theoretical. But safety requires vigilance. Enemies are made in triumph as well as in loss. I learned to read the room in a way that transcended the courtroom. To see where ambition could be gentler, where trust should be withheld, and where loyalty must be earned. New Orleans taught me commerce, community, and caution in equal measures. The divorce had left me tired and vindicated in small ways. I kept my name, my dignity, and the ferocity to protect what I had rebuilt. I swore then, as I placed another legal brief into a file folder, that I would never again allow the narrative of my life to be dictated by those who measured me by appearances. That oath would later scaffold the choices I made about family. If law is a language, then I became fluent enough to make entire cities listen. After the move and the grind, my practice found purchase. I took cases that made other attorneys nervous. Messy divorces, complex civil suits, white-collar defendants with public reputations to lose. The work was not glamorous. It was granular, a discipline of patience and detail. I learned to listen for the one moment, a slipped phrase, a too quick laugh, that revealed the brittle seam in a client's opponent. Those moments built my reputation. One afternoon a case arrived with the kind of chaos most lawyers avoid. A regional manufacturer accused of dumping waste into a bayou that fed a poor community. The evidence was scattered. The corporate files were stonewalled. I took the cause because someone needed to hold power to account. We won a settlement that compensated victims and forced compliance. The payout was smaller than headlines made it sound, but it was enough to purchase my first downtown office and seed a string of investments. I learned to convert verdicts into stability. Settlement checks became deposits on houses, earnest money on parcels of land, and investments in small firms that paid quarterly dividends. I kept accounts separate, learned tax strategies like a hobby, and used conservative leverage to grow a portfolio that could sustain us. There is an intimacy to watching your money work. The slow accrual of interest, rent notices transforming into reliable income, the satisfaction of seeing ledgers balance after months of worry. The success did not come without sacrifice. Long courtroom hours and the constant weight of other people's crises corroded the edges of my health. Nights that used to be full of paperwork became punctuated by palpitations and joint pain. Doctors labeled it a chronic condition exacerbated by stress. I accepted treatment plans and hid symptoms at hearings. The trembling hands that showed up most days were ironed flat by determination. I refused to let others equate age with inability. There are quiet decisions in building an enterprise that few see. I formed an LLC under a juristic name, opened accounts in trusted banks, and assembled a modest team of associates who shared my work ethic. I preferred to keep the apparatus understated. Efficient staff, a secretary who knew every client's story, and a conference room stacked with files. My practice thrived on discretion. Some clients liked that, others feared it. I cultivated networks carefully. A favor paid now can return multiplied later. I kept a list of people to call when bureaucracy crawled. Judges, clerks, former clients who owed social capital, an old partner at a bank who would nudge approvals. It was not manipulation so much as mutual aid. An ecosystem where reputations mattered and reciprocity was expected. Those relationships were not flashy, but they were resilient resources when deadlines collided and courts resisted urgency. Bianca watched the slow accretion of assets with practical curiosity. She learned to value stability over spectacle. When the firm grew and I began formal estate planning, I took pride in teaching her financial literacy. Another part of me, fearful of entitlement, kept holdings discreet. That decision was pragmatic and controlling in equal measures. I wanted her to earn respect for competence, not for a name on a deed. There is an odd solitude in accumulation. I had people who respected me professionally, but I did not always have people who knew the full context of my nights. Alliances were transactional. Emotion was often kept at the door. When you spend decades in adversarial rooms, you become adept at keeping your personal architecture private. It was in this blending of legal skill and financial prudence that I crafted what some called an empire. A word I always thought grand for modest rentals and a downtown office. It was an empire measured by stability rather than ostentation. When I retired, the portfolio carried the imprint of a life negotiated between survival and ambition. I had built quietly so Bianca might live loudly if she chose it. I would soon be tested not by opposing counsel or corrupt corporations, but by a social alchemy I had not anticipated. Affluence, flattery, and the politics of belonging that could unmoor a daughter's allegiance indeed. When Bianca was small, I taught her to look at contracts the way some mothers teach knitting, patiently, stitch by stitch. Her childhood was threaded with the practical vocabulary of my life. How to read a clause, why deadlines mattered, and how a small promise could become a lifetime burden if not tracked. I turned fax pages into bedtime stories. Our home smelled of paper and simmering soup. Bianca absorbed these details not as drills, but as a form of security. She excelled in school with a steady focus that made teachers note her maturity. There were quiet triumphs that cemented our bond. The day she passed the CPA exam, she called me in a tremor of elation. I can still hear her breathy "Mama" over the line, the kind of word that knits the past into the present. We celebrated with an onion pie and a bottle of cheap sparkling wine, because joy did not need grandness. Later, when she secured a position at one of the Big Four firms, I watched a private pride bloom. Not the showy pride of display, but the calm satisfaction of a parent who had labored in silence. Supporting Bianca involved small, quiet interventions. I arranged a mortgage on a modest house, sent allowances during brutal audit seasons, and funded a tutor when a course threatened her confidence. I did things without fanfare, not to hide but to prevent pity. These were discreet acts meant to keep her steady while she built the career I had always hoped for. I told her stories of cases only when they taught kindness. I wanted her to choose work with conviction, not as armor, and sometimes I failed to explain why I kept certain things private, assuming protection would be a quiet gift rather than a wedge. We had a rhythm of rituals. Friday dinners where we shared stories of small victories, late-night phone calls when she was too exhausted to make sense of her problems, and a language of gestures. Leftover coffee cups on the counter meant comfort. A folded note on the fridge meant, "I am thinking of you." Those rituals were our currency. They meant more than the number of properties in a bank account. They were the scaffolding of intimacy that kept me steady through legal fights and nights of insomnia. Bianca's world began to expand as her career advanced. Projects took her out of town. Promotions meant dinners with partners, and soon she traveled to audit clients in Chicago and Atlanta. I tried not to be possessive, to encourage her networking and growth. When she met people who dazzled with easy choices and promises, I tried to trust her judgment. I remembered my own youth, the times I had been charmed into risky partnerships and the humiliation that followed. So I softened when advice was needed. Listen, notice patterns, and check assumptions. Even as I supported her independence, I kept a careful watch. Independence is not just financial, it is also emotional. I wanted her to choose partners who saw her, not partners who were attracted to conveniences surrounding her. I looked for generosity in character rather than generosity in purchase power. But I also had learning to do. Being both a provider and a mother is a balancing act that requires humility. There were moments when I failed. Times when secrecy in the name of protection became a wedge I had not intended. When Bianca announced she would travel for a client engagement that would lead to a year-long stint, I felt a parent's mixture of pride and displacement. I paid discreetly for a tutor and transferred funds to make the move seamless. She kissed me on the forehead in a way that made the years dissolve. The child and the woman in a single motion. I believed then, without reservation, that everything I had done and not said had given her the tools to steer corporate storms. And yet, even as she moved into the world of evening galas and partner dinners, the distance grew in small increments. She called less often, texted in modern rhythms, and began to attend family gatherings she described as work friends events. I tried to be generous with understanding. Work demanded more. Sometimes I felt like a chapter she read in her youth, and then shelved for the main text of a career. Those early choices, security measures, small interventions, and the intentional withholding of certain truths, felt right at the time. But life has a way of complicating even the most careful architectures. A mortgage, for instance, can be a foundation and a tether. A discreet transfer intended as aid can later be interpreted as dependency. The scaffolding that kept Bianca safe could be read by others as absence of agency. Not guaranteed. When Bianca called, she said she'd met someone. She described him with the kind of shorthand people use when they expect approval. "He's charming, Mama. He laughs at my jokes." There was warmth in her voice I had heard before. The sound of someone discovering a companion for the long hours. I asked the practical questions. What did he do? Where was he from? And who were his people? She paused briefly, then said his last name, Willis. The name was a bell I did not recognize in daily life, but it carried the edge of old money. When we met, Jaden curated himself the way polished men are taught to: polite smile, a studied humility, an easy compliment placed like a coin on the palm. He had that manner of someone trained to make entrances feel like homecomings. On the surface, he was exactly who Bianca described: attentive, amused by the right things, and deeply interested in her career. But over decades in courtrooms and depositions, I have developed a sense for who is performing and who is being themselves. Jaden's charm was practiced, not raw. When he crossed the threshold, he carried a scent of cedar and paper, a curated scent of pedigree. I noticed the way his eyes measured the room, practice and empathy rather than surprise. His family was another study: Mrs. Willis, with pearled composure, and a brother who moved through rooms like a man who expected accommodation. They inhabited a strata where influence and philanthropy conspired to create immunity. Portraits of donors and politicians lined their walls. Their presence suggested access that often quietly disarmed scrutiny. I do not begrudge anyone their accomplishments. I judged instead how those accomplishments were fragrance for public consumption. Bianca and Jaden moved quickly. The early romance, dinners at restaurants where waiters knew their names, retreats to family estates, was intoxicating to her in a way I recognized from youth. She reveled in being known by people who asked questions implying consequence. In their circle, being recognized meant entry. In ours, being recognized had always meant responsibility. At first I stayed cautious and intentionally absent from the drama of courtship. I wanted her to build the language of marriage without interference. But one afternoon she announced, laughing, that he had proposed on a riverwalk during an audit trip. He had chosen a small moment, a bench, a look that suggested devotion, and she said yes. I embraced her and covered the practical things: prenuptial considerations, an insistence on transparency, and a gentle counsel on power dynamics. There was one thing I kept from her: the full scale of what I had built. I told myself I was protecting her privacy and independence. Perhaps I was right. Perhaps wrong. I did not warn her, for reasons I call many names: pride, fear, the impulse to let her choose without shadows. I saw in Jaden a family whose welcome was both warm and exacting. They celebrated with a theatrical graciousness that swallowed nuance. When Bianca announced the wedding date, details tugged at me. A guest list reflecting Willis reach, events at prestige venues, a schedule with no room for indecision. I was not consulted the way a mother sometimes is, on dress fittings or seating charts, but I believed devotion would grant me a place regardless. I misread the recalibration of roles in a ceremony engineered by a family accustomed to scripting its image. My health had left me with a subtle deformity in my spine and a paler complexion from years of stress. I learned to take care in public: makeup, posture, and insistence on standing straight to command respect. I did not want pity applauded as sympathy, and yet I did not want to be invisible at my daughter's wedding. I held to the belief that the woman who raised Bianca would, by right and truth, hold a place at her side. They sent invitations with embossed envelopes and gold seals. The Willises curated an image of family unity that left little space for backstory. When I saw the program and guest list, donors, politicians, executives, my title as mother of the bride was printed in modest font. That smallness sat in my stomach like a pebble. I should have asked more questions. I should have demanded a meeting. Instead, I told myself dignity meant not demanding recognition. I told myself that if love were true, presence would be valued without public gesture. The law had trained me to assume evidence would speak clearly. Family affairs were more nuanced. Gesture often carried persuasive force over truth. As the wedding approached, Bianca drifted into a life of rehearsals and events. I asked about fittings and received polite deferrals. Rehearsal seats were taken care of. Each omission registered quietly. I filed those small silences away, thinking they were the logistics of a busy bride. They were echoes that would wake me later. Power smells like polished wood and faint cologne. That was the first thing I noticed about the Willises when they began to orbit Bianca's life. Their world arrived slowly, gilded in ritual. Foundation galas, weekend retreats on private estates, introductions in rooms where names were passports. Bianca was invited into easy access. Doors opened for her with a courtesy she had never known. For her it felt like discovery. For me it felt like a test. The Willises practiced a soft kind of persuasion, the kind that rewrites priorities through praise. At first their attention was flattering. Mrs. Willis offered mentorship like a velvet glove, warm, maternal, and carefully timed. She complimented Bianca in ways that elevated the ordinary into the exceptional. Small favors followed. Reserved seats at gala dinners, an introduction to a donor who became her sponsor at work, a chauffeur for late flights. Those favors were not free. They implied availability, favors that required appearance and allegiance. Bianca's updates thinned into curated fragments. Where once she narrated the small bones of her day, groceries, a neighbor, a frantic tax deadline, her messages turned into glossy postcards. Dinner with Mrs. Willis, gala tonight. The rituals that had knitted us together began to fray under the weight of new rituals. I tried to call less often so as not to appear possessive, but absence can be mistaken for irrelevance, and relevance is easily stolen. Jaden's family mastered a form of social gravity. They made recognition feel like belonging. Bianca, who had spent her childhood learning to earn things rather than inherit them, found the sudden embrace intoxicating. People who have spent their lives controlling access know how to make a newcomer feel chosen. Seat her beside a donor, praise a small anecdote, and in those gestures craft a sense of destiny. Compliments stacked into a ladder, she climbed without seeing the rope that tethered her. I invited them to dinner to observe, an intervention disguised as hospitality. They arrived with the composure of practiced hosts. Careful smiles, polished anecdotes, and a way of making generosity look inevitable. Jaden watched Bianca the way someone watches a prospective ally. Attentive, adaptive, always measuring. I noticed the small increments of influence. A suggestion here, a preferred vendor there, a phrasing seeded into a conversation that she later repeated without credit. When Bianca told me, almost bashful, "They make me feel like I matter differently," I heard both pride and a quiet surrender. Recognition can be addictive. It offers validation that's hard to refuse, and in its acceptance a person may slowly reallocate loyalties to the source of that recognition. I tried to explain the difference between being noticed and being enmeshed, but it felt like translating two languages at once. The Willises' largesse smoothed immediate difficulties. They paid for a shower that sparkled, offered gifts that erased months of overtime fatigue, and opened doors that made work easier. But every public photograph, every flattering caption, placed Bianca within a new narrative, one curated by the Willises' image managers. I watched those posts with the clinical patience of an investigator. The pattern was a timeline of assimilation. A smile here, a hand on her shoulder there, small visual arguments that suggested belonging. Isolation arrives in practical ways. Postponed calls, missed dinners, a sudden calendar of obligations that never includes old rituals. Bianca adapted perfectly to the new cadence. Her calls came shorter, her laughter now recorded and filtered through social feeds. When we were together, a distance sometimes lingered, like a pause before a speech. She seemed present and yet partly staged for an audience. I tried gentle conversations about boundaries and the illusion of transactional generosity. Often she would nod, and then bring out her phone to show me a photo of herself at a reception, radiant and proud. I wanted to tell her that membership in such circles often requires alignment with priorities that are not hers, but mothers are not arbiters of every choice. Sometimes our counsel lands as courtesy, and is then set aside. Still, I watched the arc of her assimilation with a mounting dread. She began to adopt the Willises' phrases, their jokes, their sense of propriety. Influence reshapes language, it reframes what counts as success. The daughter who once prized small certainties, steady work, a humble home, Now reach for memberships and sponsors. Slowly, the scaffolding I had built for her life looked mismatched for the architecture she wanted to inhabit. This was not a single betrayal, but a series of small acquiescences. Each seemed harmless in isolation. A missed dinner, a reposted photo, a compliment reciprocated, but accumulated, they created a migration. I had saved and planned and protected so she could choose freely. I had not foreseen that the freedom to choose would be traded for a kind of starched belonging where gratitude bends toward allegiance. The Willises did not arrive as villains in full. They arrived as benefactors who reshaped a worldview. My role shifted from mother to observer. I measured changes like evidence in a file. I resolved then to keep watching, to keep the ledger of their favors and to note the moments where praise quietly demanded return. For now, the eclipse was only beginning, but I could feel its arc. And when the light finally dimmed, I would know why it had happened and how to answer. I would not be surprised by how swiftly family loyalty could be reassigned now. A stranger's camera introduced me to the wedding I had not been invited to attend. It began with idle scrolling on a quiet evening. A society vlogger posted a highlight reel, soft focus string quartet, a bride in calmed luminance. I zoomed in and froze. Bianca's face unmistakable, smiling beneath a veil that I had not arranged, flanked by the Willises as if she had always belonged to them. At first I refused belief. Perhaps I had been off camera, perhaps a private photo gallery reserved spots. But other reels and a local page layered the same truth. My daughter celebrated under a banner not of our making. I drove to the house I had placed on mortgage with hands that trembled. The home looked the same. A narrow yard, a mailbox with our name. But the mantle inside told a different story. Portraits of Bianca and Jaden, glossy and dominant, no picture of the woman who had secured those keys. The house belonged to me on paper. In the narrative they curated, it belonged to another. When I knocked, Bianca opened the door, radiant, tired, softened by applause. I expected an awkward exchange. Instead Jaden stepped forward and spoke with a practiced chill. "You don't really matter in the grand scheme of things." The sentence landed like a verdict. Bianca looked down. In that silence the ledger of my sacrifices felt erased. I left without drama, because clarity required calculation. Public omission is more than a private slight. It is a display of power that alters relationships and reputation. The Willises had not just planned a wedding. They had crafted a version of belonging that edited certain people out. Their omission was deliberate. Over the next days social feeds filled with wedding photos, flattering captions, and comments praising Bianca for aligning with a family of power. Mutual acquaintances who might have lifted a hand to ask me what happened offered platitudes instead. The mortgage I had set up for Bianca, the house meant to be her safety, was spoken of in their circle as if it were merely a line item, not an act of devotion. I began to ask wayward questions. Who handled invitations? Who managed the guest list? Who coordinated the program? Each answer circled the same apparatus: event planners, PR managers, and staff trained to curate image. The omission was no accident. It was design. Friends reacted with decorous distance, polite sympathies and rehearsed pauses that smelled of coaching. Influence polices loyalty, that detail mattered. I called old colleagues, consulted a clerk, and started mapping vendor contracts. A management firm's invoices seemed inconsistent. Payments were routed through intermediary accounts. I compiled names, dates, and documents, the way I had always assembled cases. I fed anonymized leads to reputable journalists and asked for verification. I did not seek spectacle. I sought the truth of how a family could use its power to rewrite someone else's place in their story. The wedding was their triumph of image. I would find the seams that made that image possible. They thought they had buried the past. I intended to resurrect it. They appeared on my doorstep 5 days after the wedding, as if a public performance could be followed by a private appeal. Bianca stood beside Jaden, and the faces I had seen at gala photos now sought my attention in person. The mortgage had lapsed. The bank's letters were piling up. Suddenly the house I had secured for my daughter looked like an inconvenience to them. Mrs. Willis offered polished apologies. Jaden's smile tried for contrition. Bianca's eyes were downcast, as if guilt could be hidden by the weight of new alliances. I listened to their plea. Payments, paperwork, patience requested. And then I said deliberately, "Were you not informed?" The question was sharp and strategic, returning their entitlement to them. It implied documentation, responsibility, and awareness. Their discomfort was immediate. Mrs. Willis searched for an explanation. Jaden faltered. That single sentence reframed the encounter. It exposed assumption as arrogance. They begged in a polite chorus for help. I could have arranged a temporary pause or offered conditional aid. Instead, I chose not to rescue them. There was a moral arithmetic at play. I had supported Bianca out of love, not for the privilege of becoming invisible. Their request felt like an attempt to amortize my sacrifices into liabilities they could discard when politically convenient. I did not act out of spite. I acted from a professional habit. Truth matters more than theater. I confirmed with the mortgage company that my payments had kept the account current. The records were clear. Then I began to use the tools I had honed for decades. Calls, quiet inquiries, and a network of favors that turned into intelligence. A former clerk dug up vendor contracts related to the wedding. A bank contact highlighted transfers that did not align with standard event financing. Little by little, the pattern emerged. They returned to PR choreography, apologies and curated posts, but influence buys patience, not immunity. I reached out to a journalist I trusted and fed anonymous leads I had corroborated. I paid for discreet fact checks. I collected evidence with the care of someone building a case. Exposure requires credibility. Anger alone would not be enough. Revenge, in my world, is the accumulation of facts. I leaked documents judiciously, verified links tying the Willises to questionable companies, and nudged auditors who owed me favors. The scaffolding of their image had been built on donations, contracts, and board seats. It had seams that could be pried open. I never intended to break Bianca's life. My aim was correction. To make public the architecture that allowed a family to edit out inconvenient truths. The mortgage was only a doorway. What stood behind it were years of transactions that needed daylight. As journalists began to probe, the family's publicists drafted bandaged statements. But documents have a momentum of their own. I began assembling the ledger of names, dates, and accounts. Bankers muttered the word structuring. A contractor's bid looked padded. An invoice had been routed through an intermediary. Each fact was a stitch. For every favor the Willises called upon to protect themselves, I had a ledger entry, a witness, or a document. They had come to my door seeking rescue. They found a refusal couched in law and principle. I learned to value small truths because large lies crumble under their weight. After the mortgage confrontation, the work became methodical. Calls, FOIA requests, bank contacts, and a patient sifting of public records. I had a network of favors cultivated over decades. Clerks who remembered file numbers, a retired auditor who owed me a lunch, a journalist who knew how to verify without spectacle. Together they formed a small engine that turned rumor into evidence. The Willises' world was threaded with transactions that were tidy enough on paper, but messy when cross-referenced. The first startling item was an innocuous-looking set of LLC registrations. Names repeated as officers across hospitality firms, donor foundations, and construction outfits that won municipal contracts. On paper these were separate entities. In practice they looped back to common addresses and shared officers. I traced donations that recirculated into contracts. Money flowed in ways that made philanthropic headlines and returned as paid invoices to connected firms. I dug deeper. A contractor's bid for a municipal project had been unusually high. A subsequent donation from a related foundation smoothed the approval. Invoices matched event dates that coincided suspiciously with transfers. Compliance officers used euphemisms like administrative fees that, decoded, suggested deliberate obfuscation. There was enough incongruity to warrant scrutiny. With evidence mounting, I moved to strategy. Public exposure required discipline. A sensational leak is easily dismissed. A documented story with corroboration compels inquiry. I anonymized essential documents and provided them to trusted journalists, ensuring independent confirmation. I asked watchdogs to review property titles and engaged forensic accountants to map transactions. Each fact anchored another, and the web tightened. Media stitched a narrative from the seams I offered. A reputable outlet published anomalies. Overlapping LLC directors, transfers routed through intermediary accounts, and donations followed by preferential contracts. The reaction was immediate. Local officials asked questions. Donors removed names from boards. The Willises' sheen dulled. They responded with PR choreography, statements about errors and promises of audits. Influence buys time, but not when records are public and corroborated. A federal investigator, alerted by corroborated irregularities, contacted a local office to consider inquiry. Suddenly the dynasty's scaffolding felt fragile. My actions were surgical, not spiteful. I sought to reveal systems that allowed omission as a practice. Bianca accused me of betrayal. She called my efforts cruel and demanded I stop. That stung more than any public remark. I told her that loyalty without accountability becomes complicity. Soon subpoenas issued and assets were provisionally frozen. The once unassailable family now faced bank inquiries and political distancing. Bianca, unraveling, came to meetings where auditors' red pens sketched the depth of what she'd embraced. The house we once celebrated now sat on a fault line. I had only begun pulling threads. The next revelation would be louder. Many allies would rethink their loyalties in public. When headlines replaced holiday toasts, I understood private lies could become public reckoning. The first investigative piece ran at dawn. An outlet presented documents showing overlapping LLC officers, donations routed through intermediary accounts, and invoices tied to contractors. It asked questions that invited scrutiny rather than definitive judgment. Within days more reporting followed. Ledgers and transfers were traced, and donors began to distance themselves. The Willises' philanthropic narrative started to look circular. Money out as donations, money back as contracts. Agencies and boards that once courted their name began to recuse and review. Banks re-examined flagged transactions. Federal inquiry followed public concern, and compliance officers froze assets pending investigation. It was in this climate that I filed to reassign the mortgage to a neutral servicer, an action grounded in documented rights, and intended to prevent the property from becoming an instrument of erasure. When the notice arrived at Bianca's door, she phoned me stunned. The letter recorded a transfer of servicing rights and a deadline to vacate. I could have eased the shock, but instead I asked plainly, "Were you not informed?" Her voice broke. She had to confront the collapse of a life framed by recognition rather than roots. I did not enact this to humiliate Bianca. I acted from a doctrine of accountability. I had spent decades building evidence. I handed anonymized documents to trusted journalists, pushed for audits, and verified facts with forensic accountants. The press reported irregularities. Institutions demanded explanations. The family's publicists offered statements about clerical errors, insufficient remedies against documented transfers. The house that once held our quiet dinners became a pivot point. Moving trucks took boxes, neighbors watched. Banks do not act on gossip. They act on records. Compliance referrals became inquiries. Inquiries led to holds. Legal teams mobilized. The Willises hired reputation lawyers and filed motions. My counsel advised caution and precision. Accuracy was our shield against countersuits. Bianca's circle fractured. Sponsors paused support. Charity boards requested audits. The family's social ease curdled into logistical chaos. Vendors requested more documentation, contracts were rerouted, and board seats emptied. For a family reliant on curated image, the strain was practical and public. There were painful private moments. Bianca alternated between pleading and accusing. "Why did you do this?" she demanded. I said, "You were given the illusion of belonging and taught to accept omission. I could not let that stand." She accused me of cruelty. I accused influence. We had traded roles. Mother as mobilizer of truth, daughter as participant in a system that rendered one of us optional. As hearings and subpoenas unfolded, small admissions accumulated and patterns hardened. Forensic accountants traced money through a labyrinth of corporate shells. Officials who had once accepted donations now demanded transparency. The Willises' assets remained provisionally held, their standing dimmed. When Bianca and Jaden packed to leave, they took more than furniture. They took the brittle remains of certainty. They came to my door asking why the mortgage had been reassigned. I looked at them and repeated the question that had started it all. Were you not informed? The moment was not gloating. It was a record. Choices and consequences made visible. I did not celebrate their fall. I watched hearings with a quiet intensity, and felt the cost settle in my bones. Yet whenever doubt surfaced, I remembered one clear fact. Omission is deliberate, and deliberate erasure deserves an answer in the currency of evidence and consequence. I learned early that headlines are blunt instruments. They flatten nuance and force accountability. When the first investigative piece ran, it did so with the deliberate caution of editors who prefer certainty. I had fed them documents, LLC registrations, overlapping officer names, invoices routed through intermediary accounts, and insisted on corroboration. The reporters worked like forensics teams, matching names to addresses and donations to contracts. The Willis's initial statement read like a containment script. We cooperate, we welcome inquiry. The language was practiced, designed to calm donors and partners while damage control mobilized behind the scenes. Their response was familiar. Polished denial, calibrated remorse, but the records were harder to craft into fiction. Within days the narrative expanded. Local watchdogs published deeper dives. Regional networks requested on-camera commentary. A magazine commissioned a longform that traced money through a maze of shell companies. Board members where the Willises served called emergency sessions. Donors asked for audits, and banks placed holds. Influence, it turned out, is fragile when one removes the glamour and follows the paperwork. What had been cushions of spectacle quickly revealed seams when confronted with ledgers. My triumph was not triumphalism but precision. Each leaked document had been triple-checked, anonymity preserved where necessary, and corroboration sought before publication. I did this not out of cruelty but duty. A system that allows beneficiaries to award contracts to firms that return money as administrative fees disguises influence as generosity. Philanthropy should uplift, not create closed loops where payments become rewards. I wanted the public to see mechanics rather than accept optics. The Willises responded with legal countermoves that reveal the playbook of power. Cease and desists, defamation threats, and motions designed to buy time. Their lawyers drafted complaints alleging malicious intent. They insisted documents were forged. Litigation can be theater, a way to shift the stage lights. But discovery, when compelled, compels both sides to produce records. Subpoenas are equalizers. The very records they sought to suppress could bind them. I watched their tactics with professional curiosity. Delay, obfuscate, attack the messenger, because I had seen such choreography in other matters. Forensic accountants who worked with me traced transfers that recirculated back into companies that profited from municipal contracts. A contractor's bid was unusually high. A donation followed. Contracts for events mirrored transfers to firms the Willises supported. The pattern suggested reciprocity masked as charity. When an auditor friend of mine, meticulous and unsentimental, reviewed the map of transactions, he said plainly, "This is structured to hide quid pro quo." Those words were proof, not vindication. Media attention stripped the family's social gloss. Philanthropic boards requested audits and recused the family from committees. Political allies issued guarded statements. The family's photographs, once canvassed in gala spreads, were quietly retouched out of donor brochures. The architecture of favor had collapsed into procedural inquiry. I watched the scaffolding wobble with the odd mix of professional satisfaction and personal sorrow. There was no glee in watching reputations fray. Only a steady conviction that transparency mattered more than image. Bianca's calls became a collage of accusations and pleading. "Why would you do this?" she asked in a voice that oscillated between fury and fear. "You've humiliated us." I told her honestly that I had exposed systems, not conjured spite. Accountability is not humiliation born of malice. It is the corrective that prevents leverage from becoming immunity. She did not accept the difference then. Her defensiveness felt like grief disguised as anger. The Willises' legal team tried every lever. They filed suits and sought gag orders. Their PR machine spun statements about clerical errors and promised audits. Influence buys protection, but it cannot rewrite transparent ledgers. Where they tried to use litigation to freeze conversation, Subpoenas pulled at the seams of their financial fabric. Discovery meetings laid bare routing paths and payment patterns. Evidence seldom lies. People craft narratives to explain it. The family began to fracture. Meetings grew tense. Mrs. Willis insisted on loyalty. A son suggested aggressive litigation. Staffers leaked frustration about being scapegoated. Unity frayed where it had appeared strongest. The Willises who once moved in concert now argued in public about admissions and strategy. The implosion was as human as it was institutional. I documented it because patterns matter. Legal proceedings are slow but inexorable. Subpoenas inscribed a choreography of disclosure. Documents produced, depositions scheduled, testimony recorded. In deposition, Bianca navigated questions with a lawyer's caution, asserting limited knowledge of transactions, yet unable to fully explain transfers tied to events she attended. Her posture was defensive and uncertain. I watched from the margins in several sessions, feeling the old ache of a mother who recognized a child between two worlds. As hearings drew media attention, boards rescinded roles and events canceled invitations. The family's social currency dwindled while legal bills mounted. Their world narrowed to memos and motions. Influence without access becomes simply expensive litigation. For a family that had long relied on curated goodwill, the transition to compliance and audit was punishing. I tell myself the work was necessary. Power unaccountable corrodes civic trust. I had spent a life making sure evidence mattered in courtrooms. When influence masqueraded as benevolence, I treated it as a case. The difference between mother and prosecutor is the language of mercy. I tried to keep mercy in my calculations, but I also believed the truth had to be visible. I remained ready to testify, to answer subpoenas, and to face the personal aftermath because I believed some debts, social and moral, could not be allowed to compound unchecked. A house can be a home, a ledger entry, or a courtroom exhibit. In our case it became all three. When the notice arrived at Bianca's door, an official letter recording transfer of servicing rights and a deadline to vacate, I felt the moment tilt. The mortgage I had set up as a shelter had been reassigned to a neutral servicer to prevent further manipulation. The bank's letter was precise and impersonal. It had the legal rhythm of inevitability. Bianca called me, voice fractured, asking how this could be. The combination of legal pressure and media scrutiny had made the house a flashpoint. They packed boxes with the mechanical reverence of those packing embarrassment. Furniture moved into a rented truck, picture frames wrapped in paper. Bianca's hands trembled as she folded heirlooms. Jaden kept glancing at his phone, tracking attorneys' emails. I watched the procession through curtains and felt old hands that grasped paperwork steady. The house we had once shared as sanctuary felt foreign. Now a stage where public consequence met private loss. Neighbors watched with a curiosity that tasted like judgment, though sympathy creased some brows. The house, for all its modesty, had always been a symbol. A mortgage set up by a mother who wanted steady ground for her child. Now the symbol inverted. The same house marked a failure of belonging engineered by others and enforced by exposure. I had not intended eviction to be the lesson. I wanted accountability, not spectacle, but the mechanisms of law are not graceful. Bianca said she felt betrayed by me in between sobs. You let it happen, she accused. Why didn't you warn me? I told her I had tried in small ways by counsel and conversation, but she had been pulled into a current stronger than admonitions. She wanted to understand why I chose exposure over private negotiation. The answer was simple. Private negotiation often leaves public harm intact. Secrecy breeds recurrence. As Bianca and Jaden moved out, a neighbor, an older woman who had watched Bianca grow, left a casserole on our stoop and a note that read, "Some things are earned, not given." The simplicity of the note cut deeper than any legal brief. It reminded me of my effort to earn dignity for my children, and how fragile that dignity could feel when unmoored by spectacle. In the immediate aftermath, the Willises scrambled. Their lawyers filed motions challenging subpoenas and demanding protective orders. But when discovery pried into affiliated companies, accountants found inconsistencies. Transfers labeled as charitable administrative expenses had been redirected to firms that later received municipal contracts with narrow bid processes. Patterns became data points. Data became the scaffolding for legal claims. Public reaction was a complicated tally of moral arithmetic. Some lauded the removal of a corrupt structure. Others criticized what they deemed public shaming. Opinion columns debated whether a mother had a right to wield legal tools against her daughter's in-laws. I read those columns with detachment and small amusement. The law does not operate on sentiment. It operates on facts. My role, as I saw it, was to render facts visible. The litigation intensified. Federal inquiries signaled a new phase. Accountants and prosecutors clicked into protocols. The Willis's assets were placed under provisional hold. Gala venues rescinded contracts. Board members resigned. Where influence once greased proceedings, now compliance clogged the gears. It was a reminder that the facade of power depends on access and assumption. When those vanish, only documents remain. Bianca vacillated between fury and grief. She would visit my office, an uneasy pilgrimage, looking for explanations for a way to salvage reputation. I tried to offer her counsel with the tempered voice of someone who had seen cycles of ruin and recovery. In private moments she would ask if I regretted the course I took. I told her I regretted the rupture, but not the pursuit of truth. Legal skirmishes followed, hearings and injunctions that made sleep scarce. I kept asking if public exposure always justified private pain. My training pointed one way. Systemic misuse required daylight. Through it all, people who had once congratulated the family now paused before mentioning them. Invitations stopped. Photographs on museum walls where the family had been patrons were quietly edited from digital galleries. The social currency that had lubricated privilege had been recalled like credit during a run. The house, emptied of personal objects and full of legal memory, stood as a testament to choices. It could be a hard lesson about loyalty and the price of being seen. Or it could be a cautionary tale about the dangers of power unaccountable. For me, both were true. I had wanted Bianca's life to be steadier than mine had been. I had not wanted evictions or headlines. But I had also believed that the community deserved transparency where gifts looped back as contracts. In time, we rebuilt materially. Reputations heal slowly, but some breaches leave permanent lines on the map of family and memory. Power corrodes slowly until it surprises you with sudden collapse. After the initial media cascade, investigations deepened. Federal agents requested documents. State auditors untangled contracts. The Willises, who had long depended on curated goodwill, now navigated a protocol of subpoenas and interrogations. Their philanthropic facade, gala photos, named endowments, smiling donors, grew thin under sterile disclosure. It was a methodical unmasking. Each document built on the last, each transfer cross-referenced until patterns became undeniable. I watched how influence tried to translate into legal defense. High-profile attorneys were hired, reputational consultants recalibrated messaging, and trustees were asked to step down quietly. The family's social calendar shrank into a schedule of compliance meetings. Where once their name opened doors, now it triggered requests for audit trails. The distance between public praise and private scrutiny was a gulf they had to navigate daily. Courtroom proceedings forced testimony into formal record. Depositions are an odd theater, voices measured, pauses loaded. Even the most charming become awkward when forced to parse finances aloud. Bianca sat for multiple sessions, her answers careful and at times evasive. She insisted she had not understood the depth of the structures. She had accepted gifts and introductions, but had been unaware of the circular contracts. The distinction mattered legally but less so socially. As hearings progressed, revelations widened beyond money. I uncovered a dated letter, handwritten, hinting at a decades-old arrangement between the Willises and a municipal procurement officer. The letter was ambiguous, phrased like a negotiation over favors disguised as civic duty. Such documents are small in themselves but enormous in context. They invite investigators to stitch personal notes into institutional narratives, where favors become expectations, and expectations shift into entitlement. Political allies distance themselves. Foundations removed names from donor walls. Councils asked for retenders of contracts allocated amid the period under scrutiny. The family's philanthropic network unspooled as institutions tried to protect their own reputations. Reputation, once it began to fray, had a contagious quality. Organizations moved to sanitize the boards on which the Willises had sat. The legal filings were thick with motions. The Willises alleged malice and wrongful accusation. Our side produced banking trails and corroborating testimony. Judges admonished counsel to focus on facts rather than rhetoric. The law's mechanics, depositions, motions, discovery, traveled forward like a slow but inevitable tide. Each produce of documents revealed more of the architecture that had enabled reciprocity rather than charity. There were human costs. Staff members who had once been faithful to the family left with smaller severance packages than expected. A longtime director of a charitable foundation resigned under pressure, and an auditor who had flagged irregularities years earlier spoke to investigators in a guarded tone, relieved that scrutiny had finally arrived. These departures disrupted operations and suggested that cozy arrangements had been facilitated by institutional complacency. In the press, the narrative sharpened into terms like conflict of interest and self-dealing. Opinion pieces debated whether the family had acted criminally or merely incompetently. For prosecutors, incompetence is not exculpatory if harm follows. For the community, the story was about trust betrayed, donations that bought esteem and perhaps contracts, not purely public good. Bianca's personal life weathered storms. Friends who had once cheered at galas now avoided her calls. Colleagues distanced themselves. The marriage between Bianca and Jayden strained under public scrutiny. Private arguments leaked through other reporters who sifted through deposition transcripts. Their union, once a source of social assent, had become a pressure test of loyalty against conscience. I felt a peculiar loneliness during hearings. As evidence was presented, I sometimes caught myself imagining different outcomes: private remediation that preserved dignity, or a restorative process that spared public ruin. But those possibilities require willing participants on both sides. Where denial persisted and obfuscation reigned, public accountability remained the only sure mechanism. By the time formal charges were discussed publicly, the family's philanthropic reach had been pared down. Assets were provisionally frozen, some board seats vacated, reputational capital receded. The Willises convened emergency strategy sessions that, despite expensive advice, could not turn back time. Each day the press suggested new angles. Each court filing narrowed the space for plausible deniability. Yet even as institutions sought to distance themselves, the human consequences remained messy. Bianca's relationship with her grandparents, who had once celebrated every applause, frayed into fragmented visits. Children who had grown in the orbit of the family's philanthropy needed explanation. It was not only legal scaffolding that had collapsed but social networks that sustained many people's livelihoods and identities. When the dust settled, I hoped institutions would tighten controls, and that communities would scrutinize gifts more closely, fully ensuring generosity never again masked a transactional bargain. Regret is a strange companion. It arrives quietly and demands attention without apology. Bianca's reckoning did not happen in a single confessional moment, but through a series of small admissions. Phone calls cut short, apologies unsent, and a silence that finally bore the weight of truth. She began to read articles about the investigations not as a spectator, but as a participant. And the scale of what I had suspected took form in her mind. The gifts that had seemed like gestures of care now read as parts of a ledger. I watched her learn this the way a student parses a difficult text. When she visited, her face had lost some of the certainty that wealth confers. She came with questions and with an unexpected need to understand how deep the relationships ran. At first she blamed PR mismanagement. Later she found documents that suggested coordination and timing. Gifts followed by favors. Each discovery cracked something inside her esteem for the lifestyle she had pursued. I did not gloat in these moments. My satisfaction, if any, was tempered by the sight of my daughter grappling with moral complexity. She was not a villain. She was someone caught between loyalty and reality. Her marriage frayed as Jayden faced scrutiny, and she oscillated between defending him and questioning her role. It was painful to watch, and it taught me the difference between correction and ruin. The neighbors who had watched the moving truck now noticed Bianca's attempts at repair. She arranged meetups to explain, and to apologize where she thought necessary. Some accepted, others remained skeptical. Her social circle had thinned. The privileges she had accepted were no longer automatic. The community that once welcomed the family's philanthropy now expected explanations. Bianca and I began, haltingly, to have conversations that were not accusatory but exploratory. She asked me why I had not told her more about my assets and decisions. I told her I had been overly protective, assuming knowledge would feel like pressure. She confessed to a quiet hunger for recognition that had made the Willises' attention magnetic. We mapped the terrain, pride, longing, and the seductive ease of being elevated. We attended a mediation where representatives of the charitable organizations sought to understand how oversight failed. Bianca listened and for the first time publicly, voiced regret for her role. She spoke of being dazzled and of failing to ask the right questions. The room had the flatness of institutional settings, where apologies are measured and consequences paperwork. Still, her acknowledgement mattered. In private, she asked for counsel. How to rebuild integrity when reputation is compromised. I advised small things: transparency, step-down roles, and public commitments to audits. Rebuilding, I told her, would require humility more than resources. Humility is practiced through disclosure, and through refusing to return to the comfort of old patterns. The hardest moment was when she asked whether I regretted the method of exposure. She wanted to know if I would have done it differently. I told her that, in an ideal world, coercive exposure would not be needed. Institutions would self-correct. But where denial and obfuscation persist, daylight becomes necessary. I regret the pain, I told her, but not the truth. Her reaction was complicated. She was grateful for honesty, yet mourned the public fall. She faltered between resentment and an emerging understanding that her choices had consequences beyond her marriage. We spoke about restitution in practical terms, donations to audited causes, public transparency, and withdrawing from roles that presented conflict. She agreed to step down from boards and to work with compliance officers to create clearer donation guidelines. She agreed to appear before a city oversight committee to outline reforms, mandatory donation disclosures tied to procurement, cooling off periods before donors could bid on contracts, and independent audits for major charitable recipients. Her testimony was raw and imperfect. She choked on phrases and paused, but behind the falter was a resolve to transform apology into action. Committee staff took notes, and within weeks draft language circulated proposing clearer windows of transparency. It was a small public step toward structural change, and a new oversight panel was discussed. There were tender moments. Once, she brought me a parcel, a worn book we had loved when she was small. It was a small gesture, but it carried an enormous freight, a reaching across the breach. We sat and reread passages as if to reacquaint ourselves with the person we had been before the public unraveling. Reconciliation, I learned, is not the same as absolution. It is messy, partial, and often asymmetrical. I could not restore everything lost by simply saying so, but I could help create a trajectory for repair. Bianca accepted the work. She re-entered public life with a posture of accountability, more listening than speaking, and gradually, people noticed. In that slow rebuilding, I saw a daughter grow into a different version of herself. Someone who now knew the cost of unexamined privilege and the responsibility that comes with influence. She did not become perfect. She became slowly deliberate. If that was the lesson to come from ruin, then perhaps the pain had a purpose beyond retribution. I have spent my life parsing words that determine fate. In the end, I found judgment is quieter than pronouncement. The cases I tried often involved human complexity, mitigating circumstances, motives tangled with needs, and the messy arithmetic of culpability. This life trained me to look for context before delivering a verdict. When the Willises' empire began to crumble, I understood that my action would have consequences beyond legal rectification. Justice is not the same as vengeance. It is a calibrated response to wrongdoing. I wanted correction, not annihilation. The months after the exposure felt like standing inside a long echo. Hearings ticked by, press cycles turned, and institutions retooled governance. Bianca worked toward restitution and reform. The Willises fought in court and raised expensive defenses. Sometimes I observed the theater of law, and wondered whether the wheels were slow on purpose so communities could catch up to details. Public reckoning has an inertia that belies private urgency. One of the more unexpected outcomes was the public conversation about mothers and power. Columns debated whether a mother's love should be above reproach and whether filial duty can subsume civic duty. I read those debates with ambivalence. I do not pretend to be righteous. I act from a professional ethic that prioritizes truth. Yet the label of mother carries a moral force in public imagination that complicated perceptions of my actions. People are quick to decide which roles define us. I met with community leaders to discuss reforms beyond punitive measures. We talked about procurement oversight, ethics training for boards, and mandatory cooling-off periods when donors had municipal connections. There was pushback, always pushback, but some proposals gained traction. Progress, where it came, was incremental and frustratingly slow, but at least the conversation had started. Bianca and I rebuilt a version of our relationship that acknowledged fracture without pretending it had not happened. We developed rituals again, short calls after work, a shared lunch on Mondays, and a growing honesty about finances and choices. She volunteered on nonprofit boards committed to transparency and began teaching classes on ethical philanthropy. Watching her step into that role felt like a hard-won restoration rather than a simple reconciliation. Some people accused me of cruelty. Others called me a necessary chastiser. I accepted the complexity. Cruelty is an intention. Consequence is an outcome. My intention was to prompt accountability, to make sure that institutions did not blur into private benefit. The cost, my daughter's public humiliation and personal fracture, was heavy. I lived with that cost because I believed the greater harm lay in a system that allowed influence to circumvent fairness. There were nights I doubted myself. I would walk the quiet of my home, paper files spread open, and imagine a life where the Willises had chosen transparency earlier and restored trust without public collapse. Those imaginings were exercises in mercy that never altered the record. The law demanded evidence. The community demanded truth. I tried to hold both. In quieter moments, I also reflected on legacy. I had built a modest empire not from spectacle but from careful choices. Rental incomes, a downtown office, and a portfolio that allowed my retirement to be secure. It had been my purpose to provide safety for my child. Yet security is not only financial. It is moral and relational. The one I had tried to secure had been compromised by spectacle, and I had to decide what that meant for my stewardship. The Willises proceedings will become part of legal shorthand in local circles. Ethics committees will cite them as cautionary tales. That is perhaps a modest victory. Institutional reform rarely stems from idealistic reports. It comes from scandal, investigation, and the hard work of rewriting procedures. If our case nudged that reworking, then the collateral pain, while regrettable, had produced a structural lesson. As for Bianca and me, we continued to be mother and daughter in ways that acknowledged damage and sought repair. We kept certain boundaries. No secrecy about significant gifts, mandatory transparency around board roles, and an agreement to address discomfort early rather than let it calcify. Those rules were practical and unromantic, but they were promises kept. On the day the final motions were argued, I sat in the back of the courtroom and watched a proceeding that had begun as a scandal and had become a lesson. The judge's remarks were balanced, recognizing wrongdoing, noting procedural gaps, and urging systemic change. It was not the thunderous moral closure some might expect. Instead, it was a legal coda that set precedent for future oversight. Walking home afterward, I felt a complicated peace. Justice, when it arrives slowly and imperfectly, still works if communities commit to follow through. I had not sought to punish my daughter. I had sought to prevent a system that makes human generosity a veil for private enrichment. The cost remained, and there was no triumphant solace in that. If there is a final lesson I would pass on, it is this. Love is not a shield that protects privilege, and accountability is not the enemy of affection. We can love fiercely while refusing to let influence corrode fairness. That balance is the quiet verdict I handed myself. A sentence without applause, rooted in the hard grammar of truth and consequence. I walked back into life with fewer illusions and steadier hands, aware that justice depends as much on institutions as on individuals willing to speak truth and act boldly. This story you've just heard is a work of fiction. though it draws inspiration from the silent struggles and hidden truths that many women face behind closed doors. Names, locations, and events have been shaped to protect privacy, but the emotions, betrayal, resilience, and the desperate search for justice are very real in the world we live in. Now, I want to hear from you. If you were in Amelia's position, would you have chosen the same path she did, or do you think there was another way out? Do you believe betrayal can ever truly be forgiven, or does it always leave scars that demand retribution? Share your thoughts in the comments, because your perspective might reveal the answers Amelia herself could never find.